The last time we started with plant nutrition, and we first went over the uh, we went over the structure of the leaf. Let's get to that page. Right. So what we're going to talk about today is photosynthesis to begin with, then followed by limiting factors, and if time permits, we're going to talk about transport in plants. Otherwise, we'll get to that tomorrow. Photosynthesis. Right? It is the process by which plants use raw materials, right, which are carbon dioxide and water to make their own food in the form of carbohydrates, primarily glucose. We know there are a number of carbohydrates, so the one they're making is glucose, right? Utilizing energy from the sun, right? In the form of light. All right, now because of this, plants are known as autotrophs, right? Meaning organisms that can make their own food. So all living organisms require energy, right? And okay, why is it jumping? So all living organisms require energy and raw materials to, right, carry out their carry out their functions that are necessary for life. Carry out functions necessary for life. And so animals, for example, right, obtain this via the food they eat. Whereas plants, and those are the guys we're talking about, right, manufacture it. So they manufacture their own food, as we just talked about. And obtain other nutrients from the soil, such as magnesium, nitrates, right? These are two major ones, right? And just right? On a side, I'll quickly mention why does the plant need magnesium, right? Because it is used in making chlorophyll, right? So chlorophyll is the pigment inside chloroplasts. And so we talked about that organelle, right, in the leaf structure. And so chlorophyll is the pigment inside plasts, and that is also the site of photosynthesis. So if you don't have healthy chloroplasts with good chlorophyll, then photosynthesis will be affected. And then you've got the nitrates, and these are required to make amino acids, right, which are used to build proteins. Okay, now where does the word photosynthesis come from? So making something is called synthesis, right? So making complicated food molecules from simpler substances is called synthesis, right? So building complex molecules from simpler substances, right, is called synthesis. And in the case of plants, they're using energy from sunlight, right? And so that is the photo part. Photo means light. And therefore photosynthesis is using light to build up carbohydrates, right? Or to build up more complex molecules. Any questions?
No.
Okay. And so that is done, right, in the chloroplast by the chlorophyll. Chlorophyll, right, which is a pigment in chloroplasts, right, captures the light and uses it to make the carbohydrate. Now this actually happens, photosynthesis actually happens in two stages. So I'll stop here. And so what happens is, right, I'll just put in what photosynthesis looks like. So you've got carbon dioxide, which is taken in by the plants via the stomata during the day. And then you've got water, which is taken in from the soil via the roots. And in the chloroplasts, using chlorophyll and light. So chlorophyll and light, and you are getting glucose. And so chemically, this is what it looks like. You've got carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, plus 6 molecules of H2O, will give you a molecule of glucose that has the formula C6H12O6, right? And the ratios is important because it is 6 molecules of carbon dioxide and 6 molecules of oxygen that will give you 1 molecule of carbon dioxide, and it will release oxygen as well, right? So just add that up there. So and this is an equation that will show up in your exams, right? In various forms. They will test you. They'll either ask you directly or give you a multiple choice or something or the other. And so you need to know exactly, right, how it is with the proper numbers. Right, so this is the equation for photosynthesis. So as you can see, right, what's happening initially, what happens in photosynthesis overall, right, without going into detail, but they've only like mentioned in passing in your O level syllabus that not all of photosynthesis requires light. So it is only the initial stage requires light. And also, right, I'm saying light, it doesn't have to be sunlight, right? It could be any other source of light if so long as the wavelength of that light is what is required by the plant. Again, we don't need to go into details, not mentioned in syllabus, but it like sunlight's the best, obviously, but it doesn't have to be sunlight. So you obviously know about indoor plants, right? Plants growing inside buildings, there's no sunlight over there, you've got tube lights or bulbs or whatever, and they're still doing well, right? So as long as the wavelength of light, that particular wavelength is available for the plant in sufficient for sufficient time duration, they will be able to carry out photosynthesis. Right? Sunlight is obviously what's happening naturally out in the open, and so that's what I mentioned. So the initial stage of photosynthesis requires light, and that's what's happening over here, what that I mentioned, right? That the light energy is used to split water, right, into hydrogen and oxygen, right? And then later, right, the hydrogen is combined with carbon dioxide to form glucose, right? And so oxygen and some oxygen from here as well, right? And so this stage does not require light. If you choose to take biology in A level, then you will, right, read about this, study about this in detail. Relatively, like obviously more than, right, you have nothing in O level at the moment, obviously. Okay. Now, glucose is the form of the carbohydrate that is initially manufactured, but after synthesis, the glucose is converted to other carbohydrates or other substances such as amino acids. As required by the plant, obviously. Now, what happens to the oxygen that is produced via photosynthesis? So keep in mind one thing, it's very important. and that is, right, that plants are also respiring, right? That means that they need oxygen to produce or release, in fact, release energy for, you know, cellular function. And as a result, they also end up releasing, right, producing carbon dioxide. Right, so photosynthesis, right, takes in oxygen, sorry, takes in CO2 and gives off oxygen. And respiration, right, takes in oxygen and gives out CO2. Now, under, let's say, dim light or low light, right, the CO2 produced by photosynthesis, oh, sorry, not CO2, let's say CO2 produced by respiration, is used by the plant for photosynthesis. So it's not gotten rid of, it's not removed from the plant via the stomata, right? And the O2, as you can imagine, produced by photosynthesis is utilized in respiration, right? And when there's bright light, right, because of high levels of photosynthesis, high rates of photosynthesis, in fact, right, more O2 is produced due to high rates of photosynthesis, and so that is removed as a waste product via the stomata in the leaves, primarily in the leaves. In the dark, right, photosynthesis is very low, respiration continues, and so carbon dioxide is removed. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, right, the different things that happen to glucose after it has been made in the right plant, in the leaf primarily, right? Just so you know, right, any green part of the plant, as I believe I mentioned when we were talking about the structure of the leaf, any part of the plant that is green most likely has chlorophyll and may or may not be taking part, like may or may not be carrying out photosynthesis. Right, so there are certain plants that have green stems, and those stems also have stomata and the stems also carry out photosynthesis. But the main, you know, area of the plant that does this is, the leaf. Okay, so what happens to the photosynthetic products? And so first up is glucose itself, and we just talked about it. It is used by the cells of the leaf itself for respiration. Then you've got starch. In fact, before starch, let's talk about sucrose. So, what about all the other parts of the plant? The stem, the roots, the growing buds, the flowers, the fruits, right? So they're not carrying out photosynthesis, but they are alive and they need food. Obviously, they need energy. And so glucose is converted to starch, sucrose, sorry. And we know this is a disaccharide, right? So when we study biological molecules, we know sucrose is a disaccharide. So it's converted into sucrose and transported via the phloem vessels to the rest of the plant. Example, the fruits, flowers, stem, root. Right, so these are all the parts of the plants that are not photosynthesizing, they're not making their own carbohydrates, and so they need it from elsewhere. Right, and so sucrose is the transport form of the carbohydrate in plant. Then you have starch. Right, and starch is the storage form of carbohydrate. It is the storage form of carbohydrates in plants. So it is stored. So it is, and we know from again our talk about biological molecules that starch is a polymer of glucose. Right, so it's all made using glucose. And so you've got starch granules in the chloroplast. Right, and so any new glucose which is in excess is added to those granules, and so those granules grow in size. And the thing about starch is, one, it is readily converted back to sucrose and then to glucose when it is when the plant needs energy. And secondly, it is insoluble, right? Which means it does not have an effect on the osmotic potential, right? Which basically means it's not going to cause any movement of water, right? It's insoluble, so it's not a solute. And when it's not a solute, it's not affecting, right, the solute concentration water, and therefore it's not affecting osmosis at all. And so it's not, right, if you have a growing starch grain in the chloroplast, which is obviously inside the plant cell, and so that's not going to cause more water to enter into the cell or any, right, any other effects. So that's obviously a good thing. Then you've got some stores, right, in plants where starch grains are, uh, starch is stored as starch grains. So you've got them in stems and roots, right? They are stored in the fruits, or in fact, before fruits, let's say they're stored in storage organs which certain plants have, such as the potato, right? Now, remember, starch is not classified as a sugar. It's a carbohydrate, yes, but it is not a sugar. Why? Because a sugar is sweet and it is soluble in water, right? And starch is insoluble, we just talked about it. And on its own, we've also mentioned it is not sweet, right? So when you eat a potato, it feels sweet, it tastes sweet in your mouth, and that's the reason, because the amylase in your saliva is immediately breaking down the starch and it's turning into maltose, which is a disaccharide, and that is the sweetness that you detect when you eat potato or rice or any other food item that has starch in it. So starch itself is not sweet. But then there are certain fruits such as grapes that can store sugars, so not in the form of starch. Right? For example, grapes have glucose. Another thing, so far so good, all clear?
Yeah.
Hello? Yeah, okay. Then you put cellulose, right? And we know it is a polymer of glucose, right? And it is the main component of the cell wall. And we've talked about how important the cell wall is to, the plant cell, right? So long chains of glucose, cellulose molecules are long chains of glucose, and right in the cell wall they form a tough meshwork. right? So they're like all everywhere in all possible angles. So, right, it's tough. It gives mechanical support, so strength and mechanical support to the cell, as you already talked about, and is freely permeable. So substances can easily pass across the cell wall, right? They are not restricted by it in any way. And we've already talked about, glucose being used in respiration. So yeah. What else do we have left? Do we have anything left? Yes, Haram. Question?
Yeah. Like a plant can break down like glucose into any form which it needs or requires.
What do you mean by breaking down glucose?
Like as it did into like sucrose and the
Su-
starch.
Sucrose is not broken down. Glucose is a monosaccharide, right? So it is a single molecule. Sucrose is a disaccharide. That means two molecules are being joined together to make sucrose, right? And sucrose, I believe, is glucose and fructose actually, right? So glucose is, right, you've got glucose and then another glucose molecule is converted to fructose and then those two are joined together to make sucrose, right? And then starch is a polymer of glucose. Cellulose is also a polymer of glucose. So glucose is being built up into all these different molecules, not broken down into these molecules,
Okay.
right? And as far as amino acids are concerned, so yes, glucose is converted into amino acids. They are, right, chemically different. And so enzymes and other steps of the process are involved to change glucose into amino acids. Okay. So we've talked about gas exchange. I already mentioned that. There's something called the hypothesis, right? So when you're carrying out experiments, you construct a hypothesis based on what is being tested and expectations of what would happen. So in terms of photosynthesis, right, we assume that, right, photosynthesis happens during, it needs light, and one of the products of photosynthesis, the byproducts, in fact, is oxygen. So oxygen is given up, right? And so what you do is you make a prediction. So a hypothesis is basically a prediction. And so for photosynthesis, for example, you say that, right, the plant will produce more oxygen in light, or the plant will produce oxygen in light. And so this is what you're testing, right? So you want to see, will it produce oxygen in light? And then, to carry on, you could have a second one. that the amount of oxygen produced depends or varies with light intensity. Right? So these are things these are hypotheses in that case, right? So plural, hypotheses. With that, when you're conducting an experiment, you set up a control. And a control is, right, one is a setup of an experiment where, right, you are sort of depriving the setup of what you are testing. So, right, it is used as a measure for experimental results. What does that mean? So in this case, for example, or in both cases, right, what you would do is the control will be a plant placed in the dark, right? And you measure oxygen produced. And so theoretically, it will not produce any oxygen. And so that is the control, right? And then what you do is that you give light and you see whether oxygen is being produced. And so, okay, fine. So that was my hypothesis. Now, whether or not, right, we know it is going to happen, right? Because all of this has already been done. But if you are conducting a novel experiment, right, you're trying to look at something new. And so, right, whether or not your experiment is successful, that is, right, obviously that's the whole point of the experiment, that you will find something new, right? If it happens according to your predictions, well and good. If it doesn't happen according to your predictions, then you obviously learn something and you offer a new hypothesis. And similarly for, the light intensity, so you keep the plant in dark, you see how much oxygen produced, and then you put the plant in different light intensities and see how much oxygen is produced under each one. Right? So the control is one which is used as a measure against all the other experiments and the results that you get. Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay. Now, lastly, we're going to talk about limiting factors. Right now, there's a bit of detail given the text about this, so you can go over it. It's well explained. Right? A limiting factor, by definition, and so different processes can have limiting factors depending on what's going on over there. So obviously, it will be something related to the process that we're talking about. It's not something that is particular to photosynthesis, although as far as we are concerned, that is what we basically talk about in biology, right? And so a limiting factor is something present in the environment, and this is in case of photosynthesis, right? So limiting factors, let me go back. For photosynthesis are something present in the environment right in short supply that limits the process, right? And in case of photosynthesis, there are three things. There is light intensity, there is temperature, and there is carbon dioxide concentration. right? And so if you see, right, for light intensity, right, so this is light and this is rate of photosynthesis. And what you see is that after a certain point, increasing light intensity does not increase the rate of photosynthesis any further. That means there's something else, right? Because you are providing more light, but and so what you do is, for example, this is at 20 degrees centigrade, and so you raise the temperature, and you see that you know there's more photosynthesis occurring, a lot more, and it goes on further, right, to a higher light intensity as compared to at 20 degrees. So you're raising it to 30 degrees centigrade. And so in this case, temperature was the limiting factor. You can also do this by increasing the carbon dioxide concentration. You see that it's going to go up further, right, because it has more carbon dioxide. In nature, right, it is basically light intensity and temperature that are limiting factors. Why not carbon dioxide? Because the concentration of carbon dioxide in air is stable, right? So it doesn't change. And so that's not something that you can increase in the environment as like the open environment, right? But in certain like greenhouses or glass houses, right, the light, temperature, and CO2 can be artificially controlled, right? And so you get more photosynthesis, which means more food, which means more growth, more food, more growth, and which means a higher yield of crop, right? Or plant or fruit, whatever it is that you're growing. That is basically what limiting factors is talking about. Right, and so they mention natural ecosystems where plants have adapted to make use of the light and the temperature and everything. And also remember we talked about the part of photosynthesis which requires light and then the other part which does not require light. And so right, uh, light is a limiting factor for the initial stage of photosynthesis where you got the splitting of water. Right, and then the part where it doesn't require, so the actual synthesis of carbohydrates, the actual synthesis of glucose. Right, so the glucose synthesis, right, is limited by temperature because it doesn't need light to begin with. So changing the light intensity is not going to help that part, right? And so what's going to affect it is temperature. And so in nature, obviously, right, the temperature in which the plant is growing and the light intensity, because you can't separate the two processes, obviously, right? They're happening in flow. So right, the plant in nature obviously has a balance, and how it grows and which season it grows in and how quickly it grows, etc., etc. So there's certain details in the book. It's pretty simple, straightforward. You can read it. If in case there's any confusion with that, you can obviously ask me next time. But yeah, so any questions for now? Anything you'd like to ask?
No.
Okay, so I'll right, so that's good if everything's clear. And so tomorrow we'll start with transporting plants. Okay, so that's chapter 7.
Yeah, like What the leaves which have like green spots and patches in them?
Could you repeat that?
Like there are leaves which have like green spots in them or patches.
Leaves with green spots or patches. I mean, aren't most leaves green?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't get your question.
Can you ask in the next class?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
All right.
Allah Hafiz.
Allah.